Hi, my name is Katya, and you're watching History Behind Headlines. Welcome to the second video in my series about the historical context behind the current war in Ukraine, where I explain some perhaps lesser-known facts about the historical relation between Ukraine and Russia, which aid in the explanation for better understanding the Russian-Ukrainian war. This video will explain one historical example of how Russia has been oppressive throughout history, killing millions of Ukrainians because of the continued desire to have control over Ukraine, and how the Holodomor was not only focused on meeting grain quotas, but using that as an excuse to curtail Ukraine's cultural autonomy and murder prominent Ukrainian figures and societal leaders.
United, resilient, and determined. These words only begin to describe a country seeping with rich culture and history. You may have heard about Ukraine through its vibrant traditions, from folk music and dance, warm foods, and integral cultural forms of art, such as the creation of pisanki. In recent years, however, Ukraine has come to be mentioned far more widely in the news, as a nation standing firm in the face of a gruesome invasion from its neighboring country, Russia. The Russian government has used and propagated narratives in their interests in order to influence their own people's views and create confusion among Western audiences. So, what was the Holodomor really? In short, the Holodomor was a devastating man-made famine in Ukraine that took place during the Soviet Union and convulsed Soviet Ukraine. According to the Holodomor Research and Education Consortium, also known as HREC, the term Holodomor, so death by hunger in Ukrainian, refers to the starvation of millions of Ukrainians in 1932 to 1933 as a result of Soviet policies. It was part of a broader famine throughout 1931 to 1934, in which, in both Ukraine and Kazakhstan, it was used to silence and control millions. It is commemorated each year on the fourth Saturday of November. The causes of the Holodomor were controversial and largely unknown for many years due to years of extreme Russian propaganda and hiding the truth. After 1917, the Bolsheviks could not secure their victory and retain power over the vast Russian Empire without controlling Ukraine, because it used to be the resource base of the entire region due to its chornozem, black soil. In response, the communists consolidated overwhelming forces to destroy the newly independent Ukrainian People's Republic that emerged in 1918. Ukrainians had finally experienced the taste of freedom after centuries of Russian colonialism. Hence, their protests were driven by not only economic dimensions. It was not until only around 30 years ago that the Holodomor was officially recognized as a genocide inflicted on the nation, rather than simply a famine due to bad crop. So, what happened really? In 1928, 4 years after the death of Lenin and Joseph Stalin's rise to power, the Soviet leader began to implement some of his most controlling and well-known domestic policies. To prevent a quote-unquote Ukrainian national counter-revolution, Stalin initiated mass-scale political repression through widespread intimidation, arrests, and imprisonment. Thousands of Ukrainian intellectuals, church leaders, and Ukrainian Communist Party functionaries who had supported pro-Ukrainian policies were executed by the Soviet regime. At the same time, Stalin began to implement his so-called 5-year plan. Stalin's ideas of extreme socialism led him to believe in the full industrialization and modernization of Russia. In order to achieve this, he created what he called his 5-year plan, aiming to double the production of metal tractors and motor cars within Russia.
In its place come 3 successive 5-year plans, all designed to emphasize productive capacity, especially heavy industry and power output.
Part of his 5-year plan was to enforce forced agricultural collectivization policies, which he introduced in 1929. These policies meant that parcels of small holdings were made into bigger farms, which became owned by the Soviet Union in order for the country to receive more agricultural products in urban areas. In short, all farms were nationalized. These farms were given the term kolkhoz, stemming from the Russian name for collective farms. Those who would resist collectivization were branded kulaks, or rich peasants, and declared enemies of the state, who deserved to be eliminated as a class.
If you don't work hard enough, or if you complain, there are plenty of trains to Siberia, where many hydroelectric dams are being built.
During the November of 1929, in the plenum of the Communist Party Central Committee, it was decided to mobilize 25,000 industrial workers to aid in the plan for collectivization and so-called decolonization. Over 70,000 workers volunteered and were sent by the Soviet government during the first phase of forced collectivization. On January 5, 1930, the Central Committee issued its decree calling for collectivizing not merely the 20% of arable land envisioned in the first five-year plan. In 1931, almost the entire grain reserves were removed from Ukraine, and the peasants had nothing to carry over. So when there came a drought in the Ukrainian Soviet Republic, the peasants had no supplies. In 1932, Stalin set impossibly high quotas for agricultural and specifically grain production laws to hide the increasing deterioration of the country's resources and wealth.
Agricultural production, however, lags, and housing starts actually are less than population increase. If you're an average Russian, this means more work, not enough to eat, and less living space per family.
In order to compensate, collectivization laws became even stricter, and after many Ukrainian farmers rebelled, they were exiled to Siberia. Because of the impending need to remedy chronic shortfalls of in-state grain purchases, Stalin directed most crops toward urban areas to avoid his people's suspicion of a crumbling economy. This left peasants and farmers in more rural areas, such as nearly the entirety of Ukraine, starving. After the people's attempts to leave the country in search of food, laws such as being prohibited to leave the country were strongly enforced with a death penalty. In August of 1932, the decree of 5 stalks of grain stated that anyone, even a child, caught taking any produce from a collective field could be shot or imprisoned for stealing quote-unquote socialist property. At the beginning of 1933, about 54,645 people were tried and sentenced. Of those, 2,000 were executed. When the villages were not able to meet the quotas, authorities intensified the requisition campaign, confiscating even the seeds set aside for planting and levying fines in meat and potatoes for failure to fulfill the quotas. To aid them in their goals, Moscow sent a special plenipotentiary of the Central Committee with 7,000 party workers from the Russian Republic. The work of these special commissions and brigades went hand in hand with the 25,000ers sent earlier. Both parties were responsible for the confiscation of grain all over the countryside. They entered villages and made the most through searches of the houses and barns of every peasant. They dug up the earth, broke into the walls of buildings, and the stoves in which the peasants tried to hide their last handfuls of food. They even, in places, took specimens of the fecal matter from the toilets in an effort to learn in that way, by analysis, whether the peasants had stolen government property and were earning grain. Wherever they found any, the peasants were severely punished, while the detachments carried off not only grain, but everything edible. A primary source states, they looked especially in places like hay piles and barns. They dug everywhere, and if they happened to find some grain that someone had hidden away, well, that was pretty much the end of him. He would never see the light of day again. That's how it was. Millions starved as the USSR sold crops from Ukraine abroad. At the height of the Holodomor in June of 1933, Ukrainians were dying at a rate of approximately 28,000 people per day. Around 3.9 million Ukrainians died during the Holodomor, as established in a 2015 study by a team of demographers from the Ukrainian Institute of Demographic and Social Studies and the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. Some primary accounts are simply horrendous. In one village in the district of Odessa, they collected all the grain, potatoes, beets to the last kilogram, and in other places they even took half-baked loaves of bread from the oven. The people daily died in dozens. The corpses lay in the houses for several days, for there was no one to bury them. Pits were dug in the cemeteries with great difficulty, large enough to hold several persons. The corpses were piled on carts like wood and carried to the pits and thrown in like logs without any of the customary religious rites. They fell as they would, head down or on their side or standing, a terrible sight. The gravedigger of today might be a corpse tomorrow. Special brigades were formed in the villages to bury the dead, but they were too weak to collect all the corpses, and those were devoured by dogs which had escaped being eaten and had gone savage. The roads were deserted, for it was dangerous for one or two people to walk together because of the danger of attack by robbers who sought to rob them or kill them for cannibalistic purposes. In June of 1933, about 24 Ukrainians were dying every minute. Stalin's design went much further than simply suppressing protest movements. In a 1980s case history, SW34, Holodomor, a survivor from the Kiev province, recounts his memories of the genocide. People were reduced to this state. I was right there. Some of the starving were in such a bad way that they had begun to stink already. Their feet would swell up, their wounds would open and fester. It was terrible. You would see them walking about, just walking, and one would drop and then another, and so on it went. Corpses straight to the open pits, on stretchers. Often, nurses carried as many as 10 children on a stretcher and tossed them into the pit. Considering the atrocities of this genocide, one would think that the world would take a stand, even against such a powerful entity as the Soviet Union. So why didn't they? Why is it that the world only started acknowledging and recognizing this monstrosity in the late 1980s, long after the devastating events that took place? As with most Soviet murder cases, it was heavily shielded. At the time of the Holodomor, the Soviet government were adamant on keeping the truth hidden from the outside world. The Communist Party denied that a famine was taking place and refused any outside relief efforts that arose due to suspicions in the later years of the genocide. The Soviets did everything in their power to prevent the spread of this information. There were 4 main ways that the government went about doing this: outright denial of any such happenings, misinformation and propaganda towards citizens largely unaware of the atrocities in villages, Potemkin villages, and control over and the revoking of Western reporting privileges, including the cancellation of a journalist's visa were they to set foot on Soviet land. If the reporting painted the USSR in a positive light, however, a journalist could be given extra privileges, such as a luxurious place of residence or preferred access. Journalists feared losing their visas because it would threaten their careers. Likewise, Western workers or businessmen operating in the USSR who were critical could lose their commercial contracts with the Soviet state, which was at the time importing Western goods. Journalists like Walter Duranty of the New York Times, who was awarded a Pulitzer Prize for his articles about the USSR, wrote, "There is no actual starvation or deaths from starvation, but there is widespread mortality from disease due to malnutrition. Conditions are bad, but there is no famine." His words have since then been disproven. Potemkin villages are a tactic that was widely used throughout the 1930s to dissuade any concern regarding the well-being of Ukrainian citizens. They were the Soviet use of so-called model villages, which were used to manipulate foreign visitors during the USSR. These villages would be set up ahead of time with items and food brought in to make the villages look prosperous. Destitute villagers were removed and replaced by well-fed and loyal party members and/or performing artists. In short, these villages were a facade, which the West ended up believing for many years. Along with these main oppression strategies implemented by the Soviets, in Ukraine it was impossible to speak publicly, discuss openly, or teach about the Holodomor until the late 1980s. Information about the famine was only available in the West, mostly from eyewitness testimonies or refugees who had survived the event and escaped from the Soviet Union after World War II. A primary source states, "Whenever any of the children mentioned the famine, they were corrected by the teachers. They were told that there was no famine, simply a year of difficulties." They confiscated all we had and simply called it a year of difficulties. Additionally, to avoid concerns within the healthcare systems, physicians were forbidden to enter hunger in their records of illness and death. They were ordered to give the cause of death as BBO, which was the absence of white corpuscles. Sometimes it was recorded as childish or old age weakness, paralysis of the heart, or diarrhea, which were all symptoms of death by starvation. These examples are simply more proof of Russia's efforts to manipulate and deceive Western audiences. Fortunately, in recent years, intellectuals such as journalist and historian Anne Applebaum with the Harvard Ukrainian Research Institute are uncovering the truths. Because the Holodomor provides some historical context for the Russian-Ukrainian War, both are an attack on a nation's sovereignty. On November 26, 2022, the New York Times published an article after a brutal attack on Ukraine's power grid that occurred on the very day that we remember and honor those who perished during the Holodomor. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky commented, "Once they wanted to destroy us with hunger, now with darkness and cold," he said. "We cannot be broken. Our fire will not go out. We will conquer death again." Even today, authorities of the Russian Federation refuse to admit or acknowledge the deliberate nature of the famine in 1932, which they still refer to as a natural disaster. The curtailing of Ukraine's cultural autonomy.
The Holodomor was not only focused on meeting grain quotas, but using that as an excuse to curtail Ukraine's cultural autonomy and murder prominent Ukrainian figures and societal leaders.
In an analysis of one of historian Anne Applebaum's works, author Patrick J. Keeger wrote, "Meanwhile, Stalin, according to Applebaum, had already arrested tens of thousands of Ukrainian teachers and intellectuals and removed Ukrainian language books from schools and libraries." She writes that the Soviet leader used the grain shortfall as an excuse for even more intense anti-Ukrainian repression. As Norris notes, the 1932 decree targeted Ukrainian saboteurs, ordered local officials to stop using the Ukrainian language in the correspondence, and cracked down on Ukrainian cultural policies that had been developed in the 1920s. A large part of Ukrainian culture lies within literature and poetry. During the time of the famine, because of the government movement to remove Ukrainian culture and intellectuals, many Ukrainian poets and writers were suppressed. Many did not agree to write what the government told them to write, and therefore were tortured, murdered, or deported to Siberian labor camps. Mykola Khviliovy, an example of a Ukrainian writer who openly protested against the Soviet regime, came out with the slogan "Away from Moscow" in the 1920s. But in 1933, he committed suicide in protest against the Stalinist policies of oppression. The terrible famine of 1932 to 1933 hit all the major Soviet grain-growing regions, but Ukraine worst of all. It was not the result of unfavorable climatic conditions like a drought, but a direct product of the government policies.
Russian people of power have always wanted control over Ukraine's lands and people.
Dating back to the start of its written history as the Kievan Rus, formed in 882 AD.
As mentioned previously, this was greatly because of the rich array of natural resources that Ukrainian lands provide, but also the rich culture
which Russia has tried to claim as theirs.
We can also see this in my previous video about the Donbass conflict. I hope this video showed you one part of the historical context for the current invasion and showed you the importance of being aware of this in order to form individual opinions and perspectives on the current war. Don't forget to subscribe so that you can watch my next video, taking one more step to conquer Russian disinformation. Also, don't forget to hit that like button and share my content so more people can stay informed.